The war between Israel and Hezbollah has shaken Lebanon, triggered reactions from Iran, and left the world expecting the worst. The battlefields were not only in the lands where attention is currently focused, but bloody fighting took place for years in Syria. So many peoples and nations involved deserve attention in this story written by gunpowder and hatred, with the influence of various leaders and several fronts of combat. A group of Hezbollah soldiers became the target of an anti-tank guided missile. Worried about their mortar, they didn't notice a missile approaching. Dozens of terrorists marched through the desert, unaware that they were facing one of the biggest javelin ambushes. In another war zone, Lebanese soldiers fought against Islamic State of Iraq and Syria in a fierce battle in Syria, supporting regimes allied with Iran. These positions showed how Hezbollah was on several fronts at the same time it was fighting against the Israelis, whether when it invaded Israel's borders in the 2006 war or by constantly launching its missiles, which hit military and civilian structures or were intercepted by the Iron Dome. It was an old conflict that involved terrorism, espionage, and fighting in other countries. A war bigger than many imagined, which erupted with new and impressive strategies in 2024. The news spread around the world talking about Israel's bombings in southern Lebanon. Columns of smoke rose among the residences, which sparked discussions about the brutality of the attacks and civilian casualties. Scenes soon emerged, such as munitions going off in secondary explosions, triggered when Israeli attacks hit Hezbollah depots in residential areas. It was clear that so many people in southern Lebanon and northern Israel were becoming pawns in the middle of a war where the terrible reality of innocent deaths would become just another bargaining chip in the hands of both sides. The Lebanese and Palestinians taking refuge there, who had watched so much news from the south months earlier, now feared the harsh reality of war brought to their own land. The terror began with the plans of Hamas when they invaded Israel on October 7, 2023. At the very least, it was another significant date in the midst of decades of conflict. A terrorist attack that gave rise to one of the bloodiest wars of today, which devastated Gaza. For months, the Israel Defense Forces advanced into Palestinian territory, demolishing buildings, while the militants responsible for the terrorist attack tried to resist. What began with celebrations over an attack that killed thousands led to a war that increased the number of direct and indirect victims to absurd levels. It was said that at that same time, Hamas was hoping that another front would be opened. Hezbollah was supposed to emerge like a wave from the north, forcing Israel to fight on two complicated fronts. The Lebanese response was to intensify long-distance attacks, still leaving the Israelis free to focus on Gaza. But Hezbollah, in conflict with Tel Aviv since the 1980s, would still face a new and brutal wave of attacks that would be quite different from previous conflicts. The early 1980s were marked by gunpowder in Lebanon and Israel. Many Palestinians were refugees in southern Lebanon, where the Palestine Liberation Organization engaged in conflicts against the Israel Defense Forces. Skirmishes were constant on the border until a particular incident in 1982. The Abu Nidal organization, a Palestinian group rival to the Palestine Liberation Organization, attempted to assassinate Shlomo Argov, the Israeli ambassador to the United Kingdom. The event caused even more chaos in the region. It was the perfect motivation to escalate a war. The then Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin blamed the Palestine Liberation Organization for the attack and used the episode as a pretext to justify sending his troops into southern Lebanon. Hezbollah emerged as a reaction to this conflict. Islamic clerics funded by Iran took up arms and united their followers to fight against the invader. Hezbollah was still small at that time, but the Palestine Liberation Organization was a powerful organization with training camps spread throughout Lebanon. Israel initially entered the country with 60,000 soldiers and more than 800 tanks, air support, helicopters, and artillery. The operation aimed to push the Palestine Liberation Organization 40 kilometers north of Israel's border. Israeli forces advanced towards cities like Tyre, Sidon, and Damour, facing strong resistance from the Palestine Liberation Organization, while amphibious landings aimed to cut off the retreat of Palestinian forces. This resistance was gradually broken until the Syrians intervened to try to help. And then, tanks like the Merkava saw action for the first time, fighting against the T-72s that Syria had acquired from the Soviet Union. The clashes did not go well for the Soviet tanks, according to Israeli sources. The Israel Defense Forces stated that the Merkavas destroyed several T-72s without suffering any losses from enemy tank fire. The Israeli Air Force carried out successful strikes against Syrian and Palestine Liberation Organization targets. Attack helicopters crossed Lebanese airspace, firing at Syrian armored forces. Fire was also exchanged in the skies in such a furious manner that it left military observers astonished. Israeli fighter jets shot down between 82 and 86 Syrian planes without suffering any losses. Only one A-4 Skyhawk and 2 helicopters were shot down by Syrian anti-aircraft fire and surface-to-air missiles. This was the largest aerial battle of the jet age, with more than 150 fighter jets involved. Syrian claims of aerial victories were viewed with skepticism, even by the Soviets. The heavy Syrian losses led the Soviets to send a high-ranking air defense officer to investigate the Israeli superiority. The Israeli Air Force also destroyed most of the Syrian anti-aircraft batteries in Lebanon. Attack Helicopter 1. Cobra helicopters were used against armored vehicles, destroying dozens of vehicles, including T-72 tanks. In June 1982, Syria signed a ceasefire and the Palestine Liberation Organization was surrounded in Beirut. After the agreements, the Palestinian organization lost power in Lebanon, but several of Israel's plans failed, including the intention to install an allied government in the country, and they ended up creating Hezbollah. In September of that year, Israel, which had its men and tanks on watch, was blamed for doing nothing when one of the Christian militias invaded the Sabra neighborhood and the Shatila refugee camp, starting a massacre against the Shia Muslims. There were dozens of deaths. This tragedy brought to light something that would later become common in these conflicts: the dispute over the number of victims and the use of this sorrow as a weapon in the information war. The chief prosecutor of the Lebanese army investigated the murders and counted 460 dead. Israeli intelligence estimated between 700 and 800 dead, and the Palestinian Red Crescent claimed 2,000 dead. Israel continued occupying a small part of southern Lebanon as a buffer zone until the year 2000. During that time, Hezbollah flourished in power and violence. The elimination of Israel would be one of its main objectives. It grew to become a more powerful organization within the Lebanese government, able to influence people with a satellite radio and television station, social services, and the widespread deployment of fighters to other countries. Its armed wing would come to be, according to some, more powerful than the Lebanese army itself. The terrorist attacks claimed by Hezbollah spread around the world, ranging from airplane hijackings to attacks on civilians. A truck bomb killed 49 people at the American Embassy in Beirut in 1983. 29 died in another attack at the Israeli Embassy in Buenos Aires in 1992. 2 years later, the Argentine capital would suffer another attack that killed 85. The list would be extensive, with kidnappings, threats, and assassinations. The Lebanese tanks were ready to bombard the Israelis when drones were not yet such a big threat to these armored vehicles. Direct combat also took place. Hezbollah launched its anti-tank missiles against the occupied area in May 2000, starting the assault on Israel Defense Forces observation posts in Bayada, 2 kilometers from the border. The explosions spread thick smoke, increasingly expanding the cover used by the Lebanese to climb a hill up to the enemy's defense. The Israeli soldiers were forced to retreat, still hearing enemy gunfire and explosions coming from their post. Grenades were thrown at them along with rifle fire. The Hezbollah flag waved over the Israeli position that Saturday. Both the power and support from Iran led Hezbollah to cross the border into Israel in July 2006. The Lebanese soldiers went through the tall forest and the fences, while the organization's rockets created a distraction in other areas of Israel. Well armed, the men found a small road where they saw 2 Israeli jeeps. The vehicles were immediately attacked. The explosions filled the road with smoke, covering the advance of the Hezbollah squad. The attack ended with the death of 3 soldiers and the capture of 2 more. This incursion precipitated the war between Israel and Hezbollah in 2006. Israel Defense Forces missiles and bombs rained down on houses where Lebanese soldiers had gathered. Many of the enemy militants' munitions were destroyed before they were launched. The Merkava tanks entered Lebanon for the fighting, but Hezbollah had Iranian-made ATGMs ready to break through enemy armor. Many of the armored vehicles turned into fireballs in the middle of the attacks, easy targets for the Lebanese paramilitaries' ambushes. If in those areas Israel did not do well, in others it had a high success rate. For 6 years, the Israel Defense Forces gathered intelligence on Hezbollah's rocket launchers. In half an hour of airstrikes, 59 of them were destroyed. The ceasefire would only happen in August, after both sides had used cluster bombs against civilians, and Israel was accused of using white phosphorus. The 2 soldiers captured by Hezbollah at the beginning of the war were returned dead. According to Israel, some enemy leaders were killed or captured, but apparently at that time it was nothing that shook the Lebanese. The civil war in Syria began with protests in 2011 that quickly escalated and spread in 2012. Nations like the United States, Russia, Turkey, and Iran entered the chaos, where the flags raised became mixed in alliances that were hard to follow. Hezbollah crossed the borders of Lebanon to fight for the government of Bashar al-Assad, who had succeeded his father after he passed away in 2000 following nearly 30 years in power. Syria is an important factor because there Israel would find its enemies and strike both Hezbollah and its patron, Iran. But the Israelis were not the only focus of the Lebanese paramilitaries in Syria. They had to fight against various forces, such as the rebels supported by Turkey and the United States, or al-Nusra, a group of jihadists affiliated with al-Qaeda. One of Hezbollah's most famous actions was preparing an ambush against these Islamic militants. Intelligence detected a plan by the al-Nusra Front to transfer a large contingent of fighters overnight from eastern Ghouta, an area near the capital, to safer positions in the Kalamun Mountains, northeast of Damascus. A field of improvised explosives was planted along al-Nusra's route. As soon as their soldiers marched into the area, the explosives were detonated, unleashing fire and violence that tore through the lives of the jihadists, sometimes throwing burned bodies to the ground or leaving mutilated men crawling for help in the desert. The confused and wounded survivors were shot by the Lebanese paramilitaries. Some sources reported the death of more than 150 jihadists in just a few minutes, with no casualties on Hezbollah's side. Not everything was a victory. At times, the Lebanese had to retreat in humiliation while coming under fire from the only faction that was universally and justifiably hated in Syria, the Islamic State. Sometimes, the situation was reversed, like when one of the Lebanese militants threw a grenade that hit a squad of the jihadists directly. The aftermath Kalashnikov gunfire only served to finish off the men who had been torn apart by the explosive. Hezbollah resisted the advances of the Islamic State on many fronts, especially on the border with Lebanon. Their soldiers ran over the dry hills covered with rocks. Their mouths dried up from the dust that rose amid the gunfire as they tried to move quickly. Every high point had to be held, since there were few places to take cover from where they fired their RPGs. The wounded had a chance to be treated there, but even so it was a precarious position. One of the combat medics was hit directly while trying to help an ally. The Free Syrian Army surprised Hezbollah a few times. Their gunfire sent the Lebanese into a desperate run for their lives. The Free Syrian Army used the American BGM-71 anti-tank missile to target the Lebanese who made the mistake of gathering on the balcony of a house. The missile spun through the air, propelled by orange and reddish tones until it crashed into the men. It was madness to stay grouped together like that. Hezbollah did this with al-Nusra, but let the Free Syrian Army hit its groups more than once with guided missiles. The Lebanese militants' mortar team didn't see the missile approaching in time. The explosion tore through them, leaving only the equipment still standing. The survivors even tried to help the burning bodies, but it was useless. They fled while the Free Syrian Army celebrated. The rebel intelligence learned about the transport of Hezbollah troops and the Syrian government army. Another one of their anti-tank missiles did the job, blowing up buses with nearly 24 enemy fighters. Obviously, not everything was defeat. Hezbollah took part in important battles, like when the Islamic State tried to get even closer to the Lebanese border. It was a major attack that required their fighters to focus on improvised armored vehicles or pickup trucks mounted with heavy machine guns. The enemy was stopped by the cannon fire. The Air Force also took action, breaking the Islamic State's column even when fanaticism drove them forward. One of the main reasons for Hezbollah being in Syria was Iran, not Bashar al-Assad. The militants followed their patrons, and Israel understood this very well. Syria became a battlefield, even though Israel did not want to interfere with the belligerents there. Their goal was to act against their own enemies. Samir Kuntar killed an Israeli family in 1979 and became one of Hezbollah's senior commanders after he got out of prison. He met in 2015 with his Iranian allies from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps to plan an attack against Israel from the Golan Heights. The meeting took place on the outskirts of Damascus. Israeli planes fired at the building, killing the Lebanese leader and several important Iranians. The Iranians were in a perfect spot to be targeted by the Israelis outside the borders of their country. Hazi Mausaf thought he was safe making his plans. He was an officer of the Quds Force, the branch of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps specialized in unconventional warfare and military intelligence operations. He was found by Israel after the October 7th attack when the hunt for enemy leaders began to intensify. He died in December 2023 south of Damascus. The hunt was taking on a brutal form. In less than a month, Israel decided to look for Sadegh Omidzadeh, the head of intelligence of the Quds force in Syria. He was found during a meeting in a building in the Medzeh district in Damascus in January 2024 and was killed in an airstrike along with 10 other soldiers. The Quds force was extremely important in revolutionizing attacks against Israeli forces and United States allies in the Middle East, changing the region's politics. That's why Tel Aviv focused on many of its soldiers who dared to step outside their country. Realizing the risks inside Syrian territory, the Iranians decided to use their consulate in the country to gather their most important commanders. Among them was Mohammad Reza Zahed, one of the most recognized officers within the Quds force. The consulate should be considered Iranian territory, but Israel was not affected by this detail. Intelligence sniffed out the target and the Air Force's fangs closed in, killing Zahed and other important figures in April 2024. The death triggered the Iranian attack against Israel with dozens of missiles and drones, an intensity that did not produce the effect many imagined. The Israelis didn't care. And less than 2 months later, another Quds Force commander, Said Abiyar, fell at Aleppo airport. Syria became a hunting ground for the Israelis against their enemies and attack coordinators, something that Hezbollah had to understand, because the intensity of this hunt by Tel Aviv had been increasing ever since October 7th. The conflicts between Hezbollah and Israel never stopped, even though there hasn't been another war like the one in 2006. It was in October 2023 that the situation began to intensify again. Hamas carried out its well-known terrorist attack, the Israel Defense Forces entered Gaza, and Hezbollah became active in southern Lebanon, starting a new wave of attacks. Lebanese ATGMs and rockets crossed the border several times. The main targets were Israeli watchtowers and radars, apparently to prevent missiles or drones from being detected and intercepted. Many targets exploded under intense attacks that month. Israeli soldiers were also targeted. One of them was resting under a tree when he noticed a projectile approaching. His moving shadow was swallowed by the fire. The Israelis began to counterattack. A TGM crossed the border into Lebanon, hitting a Hezbollah outpost. Airstrikes started to become more frequent inside Lebanese borders. The houses used by Hezbollah soldiers exploded. The bombings repeatedly destroyed the buildings near the border. The attacks against these buildings were recorded, showing how the destruction began to take on new proportions in the conflict. Hezbollah's rockets fell several times in Kiryat and Mona. The Iron Dome did not intercept some of them, which exploded throughout the city during the night. Many of these increasingly frequent shots had their trajectory interrupted by Israel's interception mechanisms. Of course, the Israeli retaliation happened. Hezbollah militants themselves recorded the explosions that almost hit them. Israel was getting closer and closer to its targets. Their attack helicopter, 64 Apache helicopters, fired freely near the edge of Lebanon, hitting members of the Islamic group in their own territory. The fighter jets flew low in defensive maneuvers before firing at their targets. In the second half of 2023, Hezbollah watched as Israel gradually eliminated Hamas leaders in a bloody war, while their own actions were limited to firing from across the border. With strong support from Iran, the organization was preparing for something, but still without an open front. Hezbollah claimed to have 100,000 fighters. The Israeli army estimated that there were actually between 20,000 and 25,000 full-time soldiers, in addition to tens of thousands of reserves. In addition, for more than a decade, the Islamic movement had been stockpiling rockets and missiles. They held the majority of the Lebanese parliament and had a clear stance against Israel. With the Israel Defense Forces still fighting in Gaza, it would be risky for Tel Aviv to face a new open front. A war that would further affect the country's economy and with the possibility of even more civilian deaths. But Hezbollah also needed to worry. Lebanon's economy had been in trouble since the financial collapse in 2019, and almost 3/4 of the population now lived in poverty. Both sides seemed to be ignoring the burden of a war on their population. At the beginning of 2024, the leader of Hezbollah released a video telling the Israelis to go back to where they came from because Palestine belonged to the Palestinian people. If they wanted to be safe and had an American passport, they should go back to the United States. It wasn't the only provocative video from Hezbollah against the Israelis. The group showed much of its power, its tunnels with equipment, and its special forces. The attacks continued, with rockets going up and ATGMs zigzagging until they hit a target on the other side of the border. Hezbollah, unlike Hamas, did not attempt a face-to-face attack with the Israel Defense Forces, even while mocking the Israeli results in Gaza. In response, airstrikes proliferated against the paramilitary bases inside Lebanon. The missiles broke through several of the buildings that were identified by Israeli intelligence. Many buildings were turned into dust as Tel Aviv began to lay siege to its enemies. The wolf sniffed out new targets, and its flaming fangs were sharpening for a hunt that would send chills even through the most fanatical jihadists, creating so many martyrs that it would shake the very structure of Hezbollah. Unfortunately, while fighters and leaders responsible for the deaths of innocents were being eliminated, many would suffer from Israeli or Hezbollah fire-consuming civilians, with children having their lives cut short in the midst of a war whose masterminds were often nowhere near the battlefield. Adriana Zanotto.